Welcome back to Faith, Frauds, and Falsehoods, where we explore various cults and religions of the world. Tonight, we're continuing our discussion on NXIVM. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and help others to find us.
Now, before we begin, let's make it clear that the opinions we present are ours alone. They do not represent the views or opinions of our respective churches or employers. Now, let's begin.
That's right, because they probably wouldn't like it if we said this was what we taught. So, Matt, social issues. That's where we're at tonight. And
Social issues.
you know, last episode we were talking about some of the teachings and how really some of the teachings coincided with some of the social issues. It was difficult for us to differentiate some of these things just because of how they're laid out. So, what do you have for us on the social issues?
Well,
to chat through.
We've talked about the history of NXIVM.
Yeah.
And we've talked about what they taught. So I'm just going to talk about some of the people and some of the places.
Okay.
In the social issues this time.
Yeah.
I'm really going to kind of go through people and places. I kind of made a list of some people, and we'll talk about them a little bit. Just to kind of fill in for you a little more information as we're starting to wrap up our study on NXIVM here. Study, I don't know if that's the right word to use. But
we're getting fancy. We're doing studies now. We're not just doing podcasts.
I was talking to my wife today on the way to church, and we was discussing the difference between a thesis and something else. She's working on her doctorate,
Yeah, so she's working on her dissertation.
Dissertation versus a thesis, yes. We were discussing the differences between those and what that looked like, and she's trying to plot out what she'd like to get done,
Yep. Usually
she's so much smarter.
About a couple hundred pages.
She's so much smarter than me.
Yeah.
But I did tell her I could help her with some of the technical stuff. We talked about using surveys and the results, and I told her how we could build the analytics from those if we put the forms together, and if we, start with the end in mind when you build such a thing of here's what I want to get out of this. Here's the numbers I'd like to be able to see, not what the numbers are, but what I'm trying to measure. So build the survey to match that. And then I explained to her I could help her put that together with the technology side of it, so that you send the survey out and it'll put all that analytics for her.
Nice.
That stuff I'm good at and enjoy.
She's so smart. I'm sure she's got all sorts of really cool ideas.
I can't write the papers, but I can help her push a button somewhere.
That's helpful.
So to say all that, that's kind of what I'm thinking here in this social issues thing. Because I kind of just want to fill in some more information. So we started with what we wanted to talk about. Really, the history was what is this cult? Then the teachings was a little more deeper dive into, okay, what did they teach? Yeah. The social issues here is a little more of some of the stories and things that happened inside.
Okay.
So let's start with Mark Vicente. I think I said his name wrong the entire last episode, but it's Vicente, I believe. Vicente. He's a famous director. He had done this documentary thing, this film called What the Bleep Do We Know? It was about spiritual connection of quantum physics and consciousness.
So is it actually titled What the Bleep Do We Know, or did you bleep it?
He bleeps it.
Okay. All right. So it's actually...
I'm using the word bleep, but he bleeps it. And so conversationally, you would say, what the bleep do we know?
Okay. Cool.
Or what the do we know?
Yeah.
But he actually uses different, in the title, symbols. But if you Googled what the bleep do we know, it'd bring up the proper title.
Right. Okay, cool.
But I thought you would find this interesting. I don't know if you came across it all. It's a film on the spiritual connection of quantum physics and consciousness.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something we got to watch sometime.
Yeah.
Maybe we got to get together with the wives and watch it. That'd be really interesting.
Oh, I'm sure they would love that.
They would either leave, or we would come up with a very interesting conversation.
True. Very true.
So he's kind of in that metaphysical quasi other religion, alternative thinking, human potential type stuff, right?
Right.
So he had done that. Well, he was actually being recruited by NXIVM. He didn't know he was being recruited. He found out later that they actually recruited him. But they seen this, they liked what he did, and they went out and they thought, we need him. He's pretty famous as a director. What are you thinking?
How was he being recruited but didn't know he was being recruited? How does that work?
So they contacted him and said, hey, we like your work and what you've done, and we'd like to talk more about it. A lot of the things you brought up, we have the answers to.
Okay.
They researched him. So he found out later they actually had meetings and researched him and found what he was into and what he liked, not just what they seen in the film. And so when they talked to him, they brought up those particular things on purpose. So to him, it was like an, okay moment.
Okay. All right.
This reminds me of Jim Jones, how he used to get information on people.
Oh, yeah.
And they go talk to them about that information. They did a very similar thing. Now, Mark Vicente also, I watched this interview, he hints that he was formerly involved in Scientology. Now, he never named Scientology, but he said he wouldn't want to talk about other groups that he studied because he doesn't have the money to defend himself and how much they would come after him. That sounds like Scientology to me.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he's in Hollywood and that sort of thing. He's South African, but he's, lives in America and stuff. That sounds like Scientology. And as we know, and he even acknowledges that there were similar things, like calling the tech is the teachings and things like that. So this guy is the one that was business partners with Sarah Edmondson, whose book we've mentioned a few times.
Yeah.
He helped her build the Vancouver office and the LA office. So he was actually recruited first, and he brought her in. And we'll talk about that when we talk about her here in a minute.
Right. Yeah.
He was very close with Raniere. He married with Raniere, Keith Raniere. Some people even told him, you may be his only male friend. There were other men involved in NXIVM, but not that close to him.
None were as close as Mark. Yep.
Yeah. And as happened to a lot of people, and we're going to talk about Albany here in a little bit, Albany, New York, he was asked to move to Albany. Him and his wife, Bonnie, were asked to move to Albany. And he decided, let's do it. Let's try it for a little while. Which is a weird place for a producer to live, but
right.
They got airplanes, they can fly in and out and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's just a couple hours drive to New York.
Yeah. Yeah. And everything in NXIVM was based around Albany.
Yeah, for sure.
His wife, Bonnie, joined with him, and she actually left the cult first. Sarah Edmondson mentioned that in her book about Bonnie leaving the cult and them talking to her. Because she kind of just thought it was all BS eventually. So that must have been weird that your wife left, but you didn't. But remember, they didn't consider it a religion. It was the company, right? But they still didn't encourage leaving. He eventually left after he found out about Sarah being branded. And he started putting two to two together the things that he had seen. And he realized that this was actually a cult. And people were being hurt by this. And then he just went all out. He used all the power of his celebrity he could. And connected with other former members and his wife and different things. And really just try to create all the media they could. Honestly, NXIVM would probably still be in place today if they had not went to the media. The FBI wasn't paying that close attention.
Yeah. Yeah, the FBI was too busy looking into other groups.
Well, and there were a lot of other groups to look into at the time, right? And that takes us to Sarah Edmondson. So Mark Vicente was very famous, and they were doing this cruise, and he was going to be the judge for some sort of film thing or something.
Right.
And Sarah tells the story that her and her boyfriend at the time wanted to go on this cruise, not as a vacation, but I think her boyfriend was working or something. And she got the opportunity to go, and she wanted to go because she wanted to meet Mark Vicente. She was already an actress, but she knew knowing someone like him would be good for her career.
Right.
And when she first met him, she had a cold. And he kind of called her out on it and kind of called her out on using the cold to get attention, which was exactly the teachings of NXIVM. And he introduced her to NXIVM. She didn't even realize she was being recruited for something or that it was going to cost money until they're like, oh, okay, now you need a $500 deposit, which they took from her on the cruise.
Right.
And she barely had. And then she tried to get her money back because she couldn't afford the rest of the $2,000 to go. And they talked her into taking it anyway and spending the money. They didn't give it to her for free.
Right. They let her do some work, and then she wasn't able to borrow the money from someone who was also in NXIVM. It turned into this big weird thing early on for her.
She was obligated.
Yeah.
Yes. She eventually worked her way up. As I mentioned, she ran the Vancouver office. That was a big giant deal. And her best friend was Lauren Salzman, which was the daughter of Prefect.
Yep.
You know? She was personally trained by Prefect most of the time. She's also the one who blew the whistle on NXIVM over DOS.
Right.
After she got branded, a little bit after that, she's the one that blew the whistle. She's seen how horrible this was. Next I have on our list is Nancy Salzman, or Prefect. She's number 2 in charge.
Right. And she's the one that has the degrees in psychology and neuro-linguistic programming and
NLP.
Human potential movement, right? She was pretty known in that area. So she was like the teacher, right? She was the one who put everything together, right?
So they had all these classes, and they would have people who would lead these classes. But when she would show up and lead a class, people felt honored. And that's because on day 3 of that class, they were taught to pay tribute to Vanguard, but also to pay tribute to Prefect.
Yep.
So she literally taught people to pay tribute to herself. It's funny. When you look at the teachings of Jesus, he didn't do that.
Right. Yep.
He constantly pointed back to the Father.
Yep. And even told people, don't go tell anyone else what I've done for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. That just made me think about that when I mentioned that. But she taught to people to pay tribute to her there. She's the one who recruited Mark, and that's because they trained her to recruit Mark, like they planned for her to recruit Mark, and then later Sarah. Her daughter is Lauren Salzman. Lauren Salzman was best friends with Sarah Edmondson.
Right.
Now I should mention that Nancy Salzman was one of Keith Raniere's lovers. Sarah Edmondson was not.
Right. Yeah.
One of the few people that wasn't, and Sarah Edmondson had also been asked to move to Albany, and they had plans to maybe move to Albany. Her husband, she later met in NXIVM, was from New York, so they were planning on eventually moving to Albany or near there, but she didn't. It seems like a lot of people that moved to Albany became Keith's lover.
Right.
Lauren Salzman was also one of Keith's lovers. She's one of the people who was promised a altar baby. Altar baby? Icon baby? What's the name? What's the term?
I don't recall hearing that term. May have been right at the very end of Edmondson's book.
It may be maybe altar. I think I got that from the Frank Report website.
Okay.
Basically a baby from Keith.
Right.
Who's supposed to be special. But he never would give her one. And
yeah, I remember Edmondson talking about that a bit, because she had wanted a baby, but it wasn't actually ever going to happen, even though it had been promised.
She is the only woman who was charged at the end during the trial who did not get any jail time.
Right.
And that's because of the testimony that she gave and the evidence that she gave herself. Everybody else got some jail time. She got nothing because she gave so much against him. Unfortunately, it ruined the relationship between Sarah and Lauren. They're not friends any longer. But
yeah, I could see that.
but they're both out of NXIVM.
Yeah.
Next is the Bronfman sisters. They were heirs to billions of dollars. They had money.
Yep, the Seagram's empire.
Yes. And their father did not like Keith Raniere.
No.
but he loved his daughters, and they were grown. They were not underage at this point. They bankrolled so much stuff. Keith decided he wanted to try futures trading one time, and he took millions of dollars of their money and just lost it.
Yep.
One of the Bronfman sisters was the CFO and managed the money for the company. Not the bookkeeper, but the CFO. There's a difference. Right. Because both of those, the bookkeeper and the CFO, went to prison. One of the Bronfman daughters went to prison. The Dalai Lama story. Did you see about this?
I heard about the Dalai Lama. Yes.
So they convinced the Dalai Lama to meet with Raniere and speak at an event with him.
Mm-hmm.
So they concocted this group. They started a nonprofit group called the World Ethical Foundations Consortium.
Right.
If y'all recall from the teachings episode, they were teaching people to be ethical.
Yep.
And they started this group called the World Ethical Foundations Consortium. The story is that they paid the personal emissary of peace of the Dalai Lama $1 million speaking fee for, do you call him the Dalai, the Lama? I'm not sure how you refer to him.
The Dalai Lama, yeah.
The Dalai Lama to come and speak at a conference they were going to host.
Mm-hmm.
He canceled the first time, but they later actually flew to India and convinced him to come on and do it. I figure $1 million helps with that. But hey, 2 local colleges declined to host because a lot of people around Albany thought that NXIVM people were kind of cultish.
Right.
So 2 local colleges were like, oh, we don't want anything to do with this NXIVM people doing something. It wasn't advertised as a NXIVM event, but it was a bunch of NXIVM people involved. Mm-hmm. It was advertised as a World Ethical Foundations Consortium. And the Bronfman sisters were well known to be funding NXIVM. The Dalai Lama actually placed a Tibetan cloth around Raniere's neck while on stage. Apparently he does this a lot. I looked into that. This was not necessarily a certain special honor. He just is it's an honor when he greets somebody who's important or whatever and talks with them.
But I'm sure that Raniere made it into this is a big deal, right? The Dalai Lama doesn't do this for everybody.
Well, I watched the video of it.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. A couple of things. They invited other people to this thing besides the Dalai Lama, but he was the reason in the center stage.
Oh, yeah.
They invited the mayor who was there. They invited some state senators who were there. They invited a bishop. I did not find out who exactly the bishop was to find out what denomination or wherever it was from. But there was a bishop there of some sort. NXIVM doesn't have anything like that. So these were local people, for this World Ethical Foundations Consortium. And they had the Dalai Lama speak, and he spoke in his normal way he speaks, which is pretty, I'm an average Joe, but I don't speak English as my first language type thing. And very slow and patterned speech. I don't know if you ever heard the Dalai Lama speak before, but that's how he talks. But very important was that all these important people were on the stage. Dalai Lama's in the center, and they're all on chairs around him like it's a political thing or something, right? Mm-hmm. But Raniere was not on the stage for most of this. He was on the stage when that thing was put around his neck. He was with his people on the first row, sitting there as if he were sitting at the Lama's feet, listening to the teachings.
Right.
Very important, right? Mm-hmm. Because he didn't prop himself up. He let other people prop himself. He let other people introduce him. He didn't put this together. Yep. He made it look like the Lama socked him out, but really they brought him in. And then there's the issue of the $1 million.
Right.
This is where some of the controversy comes in. The Dalai Lama's people claim that he never charges speaking fees and was not paid anything at all. While watching the conference, the Dalai Lama mentioned that he had not been to Albany before, and he said he's not been because he hasn't been invited. It was kind of one of those, really? Okay. And he's like, if he when he got invited, he decided to come because if someone invites you, you should come. But he's never been before. He's been to New York many times, but he's never been to Albany because he hasn't been invited. Kind of made a whole thing about it, Mm-hmm. But his people claim now that he was not paid anything, that he doesn't charge a speaker fee, and he does not endorse NXIVM. And he didn't say at the conference he endorsed NXIVM.
Right.
He just was there.
He was just there. Yep.
However, his personal emissary of peace, their name was Dondon, was later fired for corruption.
Right.
So it's suspected that maybe they took the money. There's also suspicion that one of the Bronfman sisters might have been her boyfriend. This guy might have been her boyfriend.
Okay.
So there's definitely some sort of weird corruption going with the Dalai Lama and NXIVM here.
Right.
Now, there were many politicians there. I mentioned there was a bishop there. But NXIVM themselves had 3,000 people there.
Wow.
NXIVM wasn't a huge group.
Right.
They had a lot of money, but they weren't a huge group. So they probably brought a lot of, I mean, this would have been a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
This reminds me of Scientology's big get-togethers when they get together and praise themselves and talk about all the stuff they've done and everything. They kind of call in everybody. I think this was kind of one of those moments.
Kind of that thing where if you have anything to do with NXIVM at all, you show up so that way we can say we've got a big turnout.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. So that's the story of the Dalai Lama. And him there. The Dalai Lama says he does not endorse NXIVM or Keith Raniere. He was invited to an event and he came to the event and spoke. They didn't tell him what to speak about it. The other thing I want to talk about, this is the people I want to talk about. I want to talk about places, and then the thing here was Albany, New York.
Okay.
Very interestingly, Keith Raniere rarely ever left Albany, New York.
So even though they had locations in Vancouver, LA, Mexico, he used his own emissaries to go to those places. He didn't actually go.
Right. Well, Salzman, prefect, Nancy Salzman, went and did trainings and stuff, but he rarely went to those things. She was
the one that went. Okay.
Yeah. Now, he did, I think sometimes they did V-League in an off-site location, but sometimes they did it there in Albany.
Right.
They controlled some, or they owned some buildings and rented some buildings and things there in Albany many times. They had many houses there in Albany that the different members owned, the Bronfman sisters owned and things.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't really have like a compound, but they owned a lot of things in town.
Right.
So, and they did kind of have a little neighborhood where like a lot of them lived, type thing. And it wasn't like super fancy high end either. None of this was super fancy. I don't know that he even drove. He walked a lot, and that was a big thing. But the big thing is
invited to go walk with him. But
right.
We'll get to that. Sorry, jumping ahead of you.
I was going to jump there, but I wanted to mention that as I've mentioned about some of these people, he invited a lot of these people to come live in Albany.
Yeah.
In order to move up all the way in NXIVM, you kind of had to live in Albany. You had to be at headquarters. You know?
Right.
Reminds me a long time ago, I was at this church and you needed to go to lunch. You weren't ever going to be in the inner circle if you didn't go to lunch on Sunday.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
You were going to miss out on the planning and what was happening if you weren't there. And there's something about that's just kind of human nature. If you're not in with the group, you're not going to be in with the group, right?
Right. Yep.
But he actually encouraged people to move to Albany all the time. And that's because that's where he ran the business. And that's where he had the stuff. And he didn't leave very often. So we're talking about walks. He walked a lot. His way of connecting to somebody one-on-one was not to bring him into his office. He did bring many people into his bedroom.
Right.
But would be to go on walks with them. And people considered it a privilege. And he would have other people ask often. Sometimes he'd ask himself, but he'd have other people ask. Keith wants to know if you want to go and walk with him. Or he'd call in the middle of the night. That's the other thing. He was not a regular sleeper. He would do a lot of things in the middle of the night and stuff. He kind of just maintained his own schedule and expected other people to follow that.
Mm-hmm.
He'd invite people to go out and do these one-on-ones. And if you refuse that, you wouldn't do as well in the company. In Sarah Emmons' book, she recalls that she rarely went on walks with him when he would ask. When she'd be in Albany working, she'd fly there all the time because they'd always want her in Albany for stuff. They wanted her to move there. She had a place. Her and her husband had a place in Albany that they'd stay when they were in town on purpose. They had a house there. But he wanted to go on these one-on-one walks, and she thinks that's why she never ended up being propositioned to sleep with him, was because she refused to go on the walks.
She would refuse. Yep.
She was always busy, and she didn't think they were that important. And other people would tell her how important it was. The other thing was he played volleyball in the old Red Barn late at night. he liked to go play volleyball, and he liked to have all his women go with him to go out and play volleyball. And a lot of work would get done. And people would be like, well, how can I talk to Mark, or how can I talk to Keith about something? And they'd be like, well, you need to come to volleyball tonight. Come to volleyball. And he would give people advice between rounds of volleyball.
Yep. Or
in the middle of rounds of volleyball, things like that. I think that built onto his eclectic thing, you know?
Right. Well, then it ties back into that. If you want to be in the inner circle, you've got to be doing the things that don't seem nearly as important, because that's where the actual work is getting done.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of the social stuff went down to. They were very hierarchical. We know they were pyramid based on the money, and we could go over that. They had the sash system, and the higher up, they cost you more money. And the length of time, I'm not going to go over all the sashes and the colors, but they made you work for it.
Yeah.
You started off working for free and eventually could make some money. So some of these people were making a little money, but nobody was making as much as the people at the top. And the same thing with, they built him up to be a guru. He's the one who knows everything, but you had to have very limited access to him. So that's with the walks. If you were invited on a walk, or get to go out and play volleyball, and you could talk with him with the other people around for very brief seconds in between things. Mm-hmm. That built up that mysticism of him being inaccessible, yet so one-on-one accessible, so that when they did get time with him on like the walks, it was super valuable and they listened to every word.
Right. For sure. Yep.
And I think that's what this came down to. I think he slowly over the years built up more and more that he was a messianic figure.
He definitely made himself out to be. Yep.
And now he's been convicted of all these sex crimes, and he's serving many years in prison. He'll be in there the rest of his life.
Yep. It's like 127 years or something like that. He's already in his 60s. So
yes. So he's done with that part.
Yep.
So Brian, I think that covers the social issues.
I think so. I think you covered them all. Between, say again, their whole group is not really a religion. So everything that we've talked about from history through now has really been social issues. So I think this brings us to our response episode coming up, where we get to provide a Christian response to this.
That'll be next week.
See you then.